Awesome. So everybody, thank you very, very much for joining us today. This is our third conversation in the Embodied series by Eternal Remedy. We've come together in the Embodied series to discuss creatives. We had the thought of honing in on creative work, creative process, under the pillar of things like culture and community. And of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, we've shifted our focus to talk about Black voices and amplifying Black voices and Black experiences, lived experiences, considering the situation that we're in right now. So our guest today is the woman of many talents, Shanika Hillocks.
Woo!
Welcome us from New York. Shanika, I'll give you an opportunity there to introduce yourself. So tell us about yourself.
Absolutely awesome. And Nadia and the team, thank you so much for holding space for me this afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Shanika. I'm based in Harlem, New York. I've been here almost 8 years, which is pretty insane to think about. In terms of women of many talents, I do have a full-time job. I am spearheading influencer marketing at a winery called Gallo. They produce several various wine brands, and I'm on their marketing side. So actually just started that role pre-COVID, right at the top of March. But I've been in the influencer marketing space for several years and adjacent to the food and wine industry. I'm also a freelance writer, so I do that on a as desired basis. It's interesting to identify myself as a content creator. I think we are all creating content, but for the sake of the conversation, I'm a content creator as well. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Shanika. Just to kind of start, I know we mentioned that we did want to kind of talk about the theme of culture today. You and I spoke before about your background, Guyanese culture and Guyanese heritage. So how do you find that presents itself and helps you identify yourself as a woman in the professional world?
Definitely. This topic has been interesting, and I think it's really been on my brain to a heightened extent this week. Twofold, I think, when we're coming to terms with how we identify in the space and how that has allowed us to experience various microaggressions and then, of course, our life learnings. As you mentioned, my grandma is from Guyana, my grandpa is from St. Vincent, and I was raised by my grandparents. So definitely have a different perspective growing up, and even wrestling with the Black parts of myself. I think that's one thing that I'm seeing a lot from the Afro-Latina community in solidarity with the Black community, highlighting, I would say I'm Dominican and ignore the historical and very much so cultural implications of Blackness within that Latinx culture. And so I myself, when I was younger, I remember in school, there's, you fill out things for standardized tests, right? And they're like, okay, here's your ethnicity. And it's like African-American, Black, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, etc. And I remember going all the way to the bottom and checking the other box and then writing out Chinese, Vincentian, all of these things based on that claim to it and not necessarily proclaiming my Blackness. And I think that is something that I'm thinking about now that I've, undergone learnings and been able to read history and understand that place in our culture. And so I think it's important to understand that while we are demanding that white people show up for us, it's also me having to identify that I didn't come to this place with perfection, right? I too had to learn and unlearn various things. And so I do want to flag that. And I think it's an important point to bring across.
And so in mentioning things that you've had to learn and unlearn, how do you think a Caribbean background shaped your experience compared to Americans that identify strictly as Black or African American without any connection to something like a Caribbean or an African descent?
Definitely. I would say colorism is the biggest thing for me. I recall when I started having crushes on boys in elementary school, and I would, excitedly be like, yeah, well, I would tell my mom about the different boys, but I would remember being like, well, he's light skinned, and then name all his positive qualities. And then I'd be like, well, this Black boy is trying to talk to me, and I remember those things like coming out of my mouth, communicating those things to my mom, based on hearing my grandparents say things in negative connotations specific to the Black community. For instance, watching the news, and then, if an arrest were to happen or a crime in a specific neighborhood, my grandparents would articulate things like, this only happens in the ghetto, or, we're in this neighborhood, you go to a great school, just like remember those things. And so that, to me, are those two examples definitely are relevant to the discussion, and something that I've definitely been meditating on the past couple of days.
Really interesting. Those small points you mentioned tied into something you mentioned earlier on to the microaggressions, the small comments where we are dividing culture based on even complexion within the Black culture. Can you speak a bit about the experience that you've had with these microaggressions, be it ones that we see in our community, or be it ones that come from outside that we face in our day-to-day?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest examples that I can speak to is my college experience. As some of you may know, Stefan and I went to and Mark, a small private liberal arts school in DeLand, Florida. So that's about 50 minutes or so outside of Orlando, and predominantly white, and in social circles, predominantly white. I joined a sorority and was the only Black girl in my sorority. And then my junior year, I believe, I ended up living in the sorority house for a semester. And, living in a space with your friends versus kind of like having your own space and then going to hang socially definitely allows them and you to observe your intimacy with your space, right? And so little things like, can I use your cocoa butter? Or, I'm going out to tan, I'll be as dark as you. Or even comments like, yeah, well, you're not really Black. Those small but very piercing comments definitely have come about from those individuals in school, even colleagues. So microaggression A through like C that I just mentioned there, for sure.
Did you feel like you were silenced when you faced these? Did you feel like you had a space to communicate the how unacceptable some of these things were as they came across you?
I think at that point, I would roll my eyes and then I would go call like my best girlfriends who were Black and Spanish from high school and be like, girl, you already know, like, I already expected this. But I would then be able to just articulate, because I knew those individuals had emotional bandwidth and also the understanding, right? Like, I think that's such a parallel to what's happening today in terms of the hyper visibility that is now on Black people because of the Blackout Tuesday that happened, and this rush of just like followers to a feed, purchases of Black brands, going to go get food from Black owned eateries around town. And it's just like, yeah, you may be offering and trying to support, but you need to understand that this did not arise because of the murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery. It's been ingrained in our systematic institutions and our society for centuries. And I think that's a big thing that I do want to flag and have called out in a lot of these new intimate conversations on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and comparing, and you mentioned kind of where we're at today, comparing everything leading up today and this hyper attention that we're paying to the situation right now, including so many people that were not paying attention before. How do you think we can positively impact our behavior following what's going on right here and right now to ensure that we are eliminating microaggressions and allowing for people to use their voice and speak against the injustices or the microaggressions and really racial injustice as it in any way it presents itself?
Absolutely. And we had touched on this a little bit earlier in our conversation, but I think a lot of these actions are presenting itself as very knee-jerk to me personally and to other fellow Black women and men. I think oftentimes when you make a decision and you decide for it to be long-term, that there is a stillness that does need to happen, right? Like, why are you following me? Is it because somebody like put my name in a story? Um, are you going to now respond to the calls to action that I place specifically to you? Are you going to commit in some way, shape, or form outside of just dropping money in one of these donations or signing a petition? Um, are you going to be part of your ally group in your place of work? Are you going to be in the break room when things happen and speak up? Like, these are the types of things that I'm thinking about. And, it doesn't just happen here. Like, it needs to be in your intimate spaces, your family, your homes, even in the observations now in the street. Like, people are using their bodies in form to protest. And then how are you showing up in those spaces that are predominantly African American or, BIPOC? Are you going to be utilizing your body, or are you there to take some photos for the gram to like say that you were present? So those are the type of things that I think about often. Can you repeat? I feel like I'm just missing your tail end of the question to this point.
It was mostly just kind of what's going to incite change in the long term and impactfully beyond holding up a sign as we walk down the street today, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And I will say it's been an interesting line that I'm walking right now, because do I feel like that is my responsibility to educate you, white people? No. But there is some sense of resource and learning that I am going to be putting on my feeds naturally, right? Like, that's always been my intention, is to add value to whomever is following me. But I do believe that it does have to rest not only on us. Individuals need to speak up and I think band together. It doesn't right now. I think there's a lot of like white people, Black people narrative. And I don't want this to come off as saying that we are going to be separating ourselves. In fact, we do know, and it's historically shown, that in order for injustice and people, those of the who are not the oppressed, do need to come together to speak to those who are being oppressed. So I think that is a huge thing. This is such a trope in gender rights as well, LGBTQ plus community. And so, us showing up as allies for them is important. And that's an example that I think should be applied to what's going on today.
Yeah, I want to continue on the topic of positive narratives. Stefan and I had a conversation the other day where he said something about what we're creating and what we're adding rather than working on removing. So what are some examples of the positive narratives that you think should exist and we should encourage in the Black community?
Absolutely. I think for one, what I'm really enjoying is those who are holding space, responding, and I'm saying those as in Black people, are also speaking to Black people to remind them that in order for you to do this revolutionary work, being able to take care of yourself is key. Like, rest is revolutionary. And in times like these, we've seen it in the civil rights movement. Even when you guys were talking about someone handing out curry in Westminster today, like, offering yourself as a resource, like eating, hydrating yourself, keeping protected, offering space, and knowing that you have someplace to go if in fact, you come up to the curfew, like being able to care in yourself. And I don't want to say the word strategically, but I think specific to protest, there is a strategy that needs to happen. But in general, I had to put my phone in a cupboard and close it, because it's this push and pull where you definitely want to stay focused and want to engage and want to respond, but then it's just like, I have a headache and I want to show up today being able to speak in the best version of myself. Today I was like, no, I'm going to go on a bike ride, I'm going to do my upper body workout, I'm going to hydrate, and then I'm going to hold space here. So I think care is huge, and I love that Black people are reminding each other of that as well. Just as you have to show up, and as hard as you're going to show up, you have to go equally as hard to take care of yourself and prioritize that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it uplifting and encouraging that a lot of people are really holding that, making sure that narrative of making sure that we're resting and that we are really being mindful of ourselves and our bodies as we're putting ourselves through this trauma, is to make sure that we make it out to the other end. super important. And I think that's extremely encouraging. One topic we kind of touched on a little earlier, and you and I spoke about the other day, we spoke about different generations. So we spoke about the experiences that our parents, and in your case, you would say your grandparents, are going through. Now, in terms of things that you learned and unlearned, you mentioned that some of those narratives came from them. So I just want to kind of, in general, touch on the topic of that generation and how you see they are living in our current era of the riots and the protests and the movement and everything that's going on.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting, right? Because overarchingly, outside of this specific moment in time, I know for me, as I've grown into now adulthood and having very adult conversations and talking about like, yeah, girl, the expenses and all of this, you're able to almost get on a little bit of an equal playing field now because you understand what your parents were going through to kind of balance home and take care of bills and do all of this. And I would say in the last like 5 years or so, especially now being up north, my family's in Florida. So being able to communicate on that level has shown me that now I can speak to them adult to adult versus child to adult or adult to child. Um, Specifically, I think, you know, I'm in contact with my mom, and one of the things that she's communicated to me was her attendance at George Floyd's memorial. You know, we all know it was available for viewing, and she's just simply expressed. We hadn't talked about it too much. You know, I definitely had expressed some emotions to her and some of the things that were taking place in terms of on social and in the work in my, you know, current employer's space. But all she said was, you know, I attended and I was just like left heartbroken. And that sentiment alone, it was a simple sentence that she said on a text. And I said, she understands me. Like from an emotional standpoint, I get it. And she gets it. Now, with my grandma, you know, even when I had told her, yeah, I walked past a protest, the very first one that happened last weekend, just very precautionary words, things that she said to me before, but like, you better be careful. Or even when I was like, yeah, well, we're talking about it at work and I'm voicing my opinion. You just started that job. So, it's almost, she's taking her very own experience and maybe some of the actions that she has done in the past herself when potential things have gone on in terms of racial injustice and passing that to me. But I can't get angry at that. That's her experience and what she knows and how she survived, right? And so I oftentimes have to remember that our parents are doing and have done the best that they can based on what they know, but that is the kind of the goal, right? To pass that on and then to have your children be able to educate and do what they need to do to pass it on again and again. So I think that has been my approach the last few years, but particularly for this week in conversations with both of them.
Right. I want to also pose that question to the Eternal Remedy team, Mark, Kat, Steph. Have any of you guys spoken to your parents about what they're experiencing right now?
A bit. I'm kind of a little bit. I'm quite similar to what Shanika had expressed in that. Yeah, my dad was giving me very precautionary advice, and I'm interested in if the experience again, like the ways that our parents and us. The ways that we maybe look at what places like America and Britain and Canada are might be completely different. I think we're starting to like unpack and unpick what America was supposed to be, what these places were supposed to be for people who had come over from the Caribbean or other countries in the world. And I think the perspective of what these countries are and look like might be a little bit different, which I think might play into a little bit of, just be careful. You don't want to kind of disturb the peace too much. And that seems to be where that kind of ties in a bit. And I think now that everything is opened up, we're kind of like, no, you know what? Like, we are going to disturb the peace a bit because it matters and it means something. And especially like in the healthcare fields, when a lot of people from the Caribbean had like come over to, like so many of my family members had come over to England and worked in hospitals. And then you have things with like the Windrush and the deportation of all these nurses that were undocumented or didn't ever get citizenship. And you think that wasn't what their ideas of coming to England and Toronto and America were. They didn't think that this is what it would become. And so, yeah, I think going back to what Shanika had said is that, yeah, a lot of the advice I've gotten my dad is just kind of just stay home and don't catch COVID. Was basically kind of all he had said. He wasn't really leaning too much towards the, you know, the other stuff that was a bit too much for him and even as a Black man and as a Jamaican Black man, it was like, he wasn't really trying to have that too much of that conversation, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, something that you said is, it makes me wonder, is it pain? Is it pain that's blocking him from wanting to have that conversation with you? Is it trauma? Is it, is it having seen before blood on the streets that's making him not want to by instinct speak to his child about it? You want to protect your children ultimately at the end of the day, whether you do it actively or not, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, again, there was no blueprint of what the journey to countries like this what it would look like. And so I think for some people it's turned out really well. We were able to send your children to university and those kinds of things. But for other people, the narratives might look quite different, that, you were still never able to own your own home, and a lot of these challenges. So I think a lot of our experiences are quite vast, and they've shown themselves in quite a few ways that maybe for a lot of people, still 67 years old, still working. And I don't know if that's what they pictured the whole thing to look like in the end. You thought you'd retire, and by our age, as maybe late 20, early 30-year-olds, we thought maybe we'd own a house by this age. So there's all of these things that are starting to kind of break down in front of our eyes. And I think, yeah, they a lot of them just kind of really want us to keep fighting, but to also protect ourselves and protect our emotions. And yeah, I'm not really sure, but that feels like what it sounds like from where I'm seated in my family, at least.
Mm-hmm. Steph, I see Adeline commented about your parents mentioning that they're expressing their grief. Have you had that conversation with them?
Yeah, in some level and to some degree, I think even our conversations are probably gendered. Like my sister's probably hearing a different sort of story than I am.
Mm.
But what immediately came to mind as you asked this question, Nadia, and I appreciate your thoughts, both Shanika and Kat, on this, is like baseline Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In their time, protest was so much more grave, was so much more risky, because their very basic rights were granted at that time. Like now that we've progressed somewhat, even in our sophistication with what exactly the problem is, we've moved beyond just like what our basic needs are. So now we're thinking about institutional change. Now we're thinking about policy. Now we're thinking about how we show up. Like that wasn't granted and afforded to them. And the reason why I'm bringing up the hierarchy is because the second one from the bottom is safety. We feel much more safer than they ever could have afforded. Like at the end of the day, I know I'm at risk as a Black man raising my voice, especially in America, but not in the same way. Like I still feel like I have some protections within the judicial system, even within my social support system. My company might fight for me. Like I know for certain my dad didn't have those liberties. Like he didn't have a fallback if he were to get on the streets and protest. Mm-hmm. And so I do think there's a lot of like us almost elevating ourselves through very basic things. Like it's only a recent phenomenon that we're actually seen as full people. And so, and this might be a calling for us even in this conversation, but as Black people, as a collective, like maybe we should move up this ladder a bit and tell people more specifically what we want now that we have those affordances.
Absolutely. And I would even challenge that hierarchy of needs, just like I'm challenging a lot of, like, I would challenge the food pyramid. Like, who the hell is like invested in that type? Who's benefiting from telling the masses XYZ? Like, that feels like a very homogenous approach. My hierarchy of needs is like now my spiritual connection and accountable friend groups. And I could even get as specific as I'd like to be, but I love that you brought that up. And I love that we can now create our own hierarchy of needs.
Sure.
That was a really interesting point, sorry, that Steph had made about kind of a little bit about solidarity. And I think especially for people who are parents' generation of people who come from various countries, that their communities were very, very local. Aunt, a sister, a brother, and maybe a friend. And in a lot of cases, not even children. So for us, like even in this space in particular, like how energizing and how much more energizing in a global way is it to be able to take and to have space with people from across the world and know that you have global support and you're literally not alone. So that is also just, again, another kind of speaking to Steph's point, just about how that whole kind of idea of maybe protection has shifted and has changed just in terms of how we are able to kind of look out for each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to give Mark and Evan a chance to speak on any experiences you guys have in speaking with your parents over the past week before I kind of shift gears. Have you guys had these conversations with your parents? Evan, you're just looking crazy right now.
I just joined. I just want to listen a little bit more to have context, but I'll let Mark go first.
I've spoken to my mom about it, and like her reaction is pretty much similar to everybody else's parents. Yes, she's outraged. She in fact said that she cried when she saw the video, which is, I think, normal and to be expected. But as far as protesting and as far as like going out there to seek systematic change, she is essentially of the opinion that I should let other people do it. And I should, like, stay safe during this time. And I think that speaks to her, like her own experience with these things. And my mom, I think, unlike most of your parents in here, my mom is still in Jamaica. My parents are still in Jamaica. So like her regard for safety is going to be, a little bit more real and present than if she were living in the United States. So yeah, she has essentially advocated that I stay safe more than anything else during this time, even though she's proud of the outrage that she's seen on TV.
Yeah, right on. I wanted to, if everybody's kind of expressed their thoughts there, I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit to something that Shanika and I spoke about last night as well. And this is shifting complete gears. We talked about biracial couples. And we talked about, and I've seen this narrative quite a bit online, where people are talking about how uncomfortable it is and how that's not something that we should put at the forefront of our conversation, is the feeling of a person in a biracial relationship, because they signed up for that relationship. At the end of the day, they've committed to being in a relationship with a Black person. And of all people who should feel uncomfortable, it can't be them. It shouldn't be them. They should be advocating. So Shanika, if you wanted to share your thoughts on that, want to dive into kind of where we left off with that last night.
Yeah, and I just want to also say that I've never been in a biracial not with a white person. I've been in a relationship with like a Sri Lankan and a Jamaican, but anyway, but I have seen the same narrative. I have friends who are in biracial relationships. I even had gone on a date with a white man, and then we interacted shortly after, like last weekend, and he communicated to me that, like, wow, what a crazy week. I saw a protest, like basically it just was like, yes, his words were, I walked past a protest today. And I said, yeah, I really wish I had the bandwidth to like accept an apology, but I don't. And And to your point about, you know, if the response is, hey, they committed to sign up to date a Black person, I would say, have they committed to also understanding the plight of that Black person's history, their ancestors? Have they committed to understanding fully what this Black person goes through in their workplace? So I would challenge, you know, couples now, and whether you've been in a relationship 3 months or 10 years with that counterpart, it's constantly going to evolve. So why should this conversation not be part of, you know, the livelihood, especially if you're adjacent, especially if you have children from this relationship, because that communication is definitely trickling down to children now. And I've seen parents be like, hey, this is how we're going to talk about it. Sesame Street is on CNN today, I think, talking about it, you know? So I think there's something to be said about looking at relationship and talking about experience in general and not being afraid to do it. This obviously is a huge point in those conversations, but I want to keep it general because I do not have firsthand experience.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wonder, like, what would you tell a person who's feeling, I would say the person in the relationship who is Black, who is adjacent, who's feeling responsible for their significant other right now? Would you encourage that person to shift their focus onto their self and onto the cause? Or, you know, how do we tell a person who's been in love for 10 years with a person, as an example, and that they care so deeply about and they're so concerned with them? Is it something that we want to shift their focus on, or are we comfortable with the space that they are trying to protect their loved one?
So just so I'm clear, should the couple shift their focus on the current situation?
If you are the person,
go ahead.
If you're the person speaking to the Black or the Black adjacent person in a relationship with a non-Black person,
what would I say, or how would I encourage them? I mean, I think first and foremost, we need to talk about it. Like, I definitely would encourage the dialogue there. Just as this is happening, it can be open, it can be judgment free. It could talk about, hey, maybe you said some shit out your mouth, or your aunt, or our mother-in-law, or whatever. I think you have to bring forth the examples, and I'm sure that Black person may have not even said, hey, I had a really shitty day at work because I was called this, or this happened, or my idea was thrown down by the VP who is white. Oftentimes, you know, in my previous relationships, I haven't even, this is like just another day, you know? But I think there is holding space right now with your intimate people, with your core group, is so important. And the way in which you do that, I think that is on communication style and how y'all rock, but it needs to be discussed. And so as far as protection is concerned, protection of, like, you know, your white boyfriend or your Asian significant other or whatever, like, if you're gonna pull up for me and you love me, then you should love all the parts of me, including this experience. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, right on. No, I think one thing is I can imagine the life of a person who's in that experience right now. I could only imagine how kind of difficult it must be for them to kind of face it. But I think it's extremely important that that's where it starts, is right there in their home, and that's where the influence starts, is within themselves and within their own relationships. We talked last time on the call about who gets to own the Black pain. And I want to kind of address that from the perspective of an interracial relationship. Is that person, and does that person in a relationship with a Black or a Black adjacent person, do they get to own that pain? Do they get to be in pain? Are we allowing space for them to be suffering right now? What do you think about that?
That's interesting.
It is interesting. I'll marinate on it before I say. Go ahead.
I think I've already kind of spoke about this, just from someone who is ambiguous, or from a mixed race. Like, I think when we say who can own Black pain, I think what we're kind of saying, I think we should say who can own racial injustice, or like who gets to have injustice's pain. Like, does that make sense? Because we've created this idea where it's like, people are perpetuating something and everybody else, or at least one ethnic group, is feeling this pain. Whereas if we take like a further scope or like a cosmic view, it's like, this is actually human pain, you know? So to relate it to the relationship, I would say 100%. Like if you saw someone like bleeding out on the street, you'd be like, I feel bad for you. Like I empathize with you. I want you to be better. I'm going to try to find resources for you, right? And like, if this person in your relationship has the awareness and that they see, like, say myself or somebody else in pain, I would 100%, if they were dating me or they were married to me, I'd say I would 100% accept them or expect them to like have some sort of empathy and to support me in carrying my pain. Because it's just like, we're human beings. I think too often we are making this, we want to own it, and I'm like, I don't want to own this as like, this is mine and like you can't understand it as much as this is this is just like a general experience, and that right now the focus is on my color, and I know you can acknowledge that I'm in pain. You don't have to understand it, in the same way that I don't know what it feels like to be like, I don't need to know what it feels like to suffer the women's suffrage. I don't need to know what it feels like. But like, when you get discriminated against, or there are invisible ceilings, or there are catcalls, I am enraged, I'm upset, I feel it. And I am actively out there trying to also educate my men friends and like people on the street. And I think 100% you can own it. That was a long-winded way of me trying to work through my own thoughts. But yeah, I think 100% you should be able to own that.
Shanika said you wanted to marinate. Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I am in line. I definitely think acknowledgement is the first step. I think that's what we're seeing now with all these brands being like, what can we put together? And like, everyone is acknowledging. So you acknowledge it, but you do need to, now the second step is you do need to understand it. And then you need to put action toward it. And then you need to like keep the energy going, right? Like, this is not Black Friday and we're not just out here trying to get these deals. Like, this is something that is going to be happening and will continue to happen, and the momentum needs to continue. So I'm picking back on your point, Evan, about acknowledgement, but I think those other steps definitely need to happen.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting from a brand perspective or a company perspective or a system perspective. It's like, it's a group of human beings who are all in that system who have to like move. But I want to, at least from what I understood, the question is like bringing it down to an individual between me and you. Can you feel that? And I would say, like,
sure,
speaking for myself, to say that any discrimination, or not even discrimination, any pain you're feeling, and if I'm interested in feeling that pain and supporting you and helping you and understanding you, I don't want to say it's ridiculous. I almost said it's ridiculous. I want to say that it is, I can feel that pain. It's not a question of whether I can or cannot. I think as a human being, I can empathize and I can feel and bear that pain with you and try to find ways to solve it with you. I wouldn't. I want to move away from shoulds and larger bodies, because everything starts just individuals. Individuals decide what the brand, in the direction of a brand, you know? So I will leave it there.
Steph, you had the look on your face like you had thoughts. Did you want to share?
Nadia, you know I always have thoughts. This one is actually one of the more ambivalent points in my own thought space, actually, because what I'm fearful of or reserved against is saying that I can also have this pain at the expense of you feeling it fully, or appreciating the degree to which you feel it. Because sure, I can exercise deep empathy with the experience of woman or womanhood, but I certainly can't get to the level or the degree that it appears in front of your life. And so I'm worried that my language doesn't get received as I also can feel your pain, because that can detract away from what you're feeling. So there's a reservation there. But having said that, within my own experience, I don't want to be lazy and say, I can't feel what you're feeling, so I'm not going to go there. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like these two tensions that I'm holding of, I don't want to take myself off the hook because I know I can't experience this fully, but I can't experience this fully. So as always, I'm just posing more confusion and questions, but that's kind of where I sit with this.
Could I pose a question to you, Stefan? I just thought of it when you were saying it, and it's as the person who's in pain, and like in the context of this idea, there's someone who's in pain and there's someone who's not in pain, and say the person who is trying to empathize or trying to, I don't know, carry a burden or say they understand. Is there an expectation of the person who is in pain to only want to hear from people who can understand, who I know I can relate with, if that makes sense? Like I only acknowledge people who can like 100% empathize with me, and I'm only interested in those people who actually go through this. Because I think that there is a layer there, because this question wouldn't, not to say this question, but like this phenomenon wouldn't exist if there wasn't some sort of like demand for like fully being understood, right? Because if you wanted to be understood at any point, I think you would take as much understanding as possible, wouldn't you? You'd be like, oh my gosh, you're feeling it? Okay, great. Like there's someone who's feeling empathy towards me a little bit here, and oh great, also a little over there. And you're like, you would just want it. But do we want to be fully understood? And are we like drawing a line between people, like you can only understand me to a certain point, and I'm actually much more interested in people who understand me to the fullest extent on this side, if that makes sense.
Can I share a thought on that? I think something that we've discussed in the past also is healing coming from within. So I think the conversations that we're having within the Black community is the healing side of it. And I think the conversations that happen outside is more so the education part of it and how to be a neighbor to a person. I don't know if the healing would come from the outside. I think that's where it's very important. And then that's why holding a space for amplifying Black voices and for having these conversations within the community, that's where the healing begins, is from within. And the reason why I think a lot of times we are shutting out, or our instinct is to shut out conversations from outside, is because we really shouldn't be seeking that kind of validation or that kind of remedy really to our own pain. It's so much healthier when we're developing that healing from within. And if that on a global scale or on a grander scale comes from the community, then that's why we're having these conversations in that way. And that's why people are so instinctual to have the conversation in that way.
Preach.
Great point.
I just want to add something light to this, because I love that you segued into healing. And one of the things I've been trying to speak on and still want to, form an idea around is making sure that in this conversation, we aren't forgetting the fact that there's two sides to racism. There's the oppressor who has the superiority complex, and there's oftentimes the victim who has the inferiority complex. We really, really need to sit with our inferiority complexes. That's where healing begins. Like never entertain the idea without examining it critically, that you should in any instance feel as though you need to adopt any sort of inferiority complex. And if you are in any instance, really understand what that might mean for what you're telling the oppressor.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we're, if we're showing up as a victim, then we are accepting that label that's been put on us. I am whatever you say I am. If I was, this isn't shitty, it's an Eminem quote, but if I wasn't, why would you say I am, right? So if you're showing up and identifying as the victim, when someone's called you the victim, then they're going to continue thinking that way about you. You're going to allow them to continue on thinking and victimizing you because you've showed up to be that person.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I was just co-signing. No full thoughts.
Oh no, I was just thinking a little bit about what Evan said and just thinking about where we all are on our timelines in our own individual lives, as it pertains to race, as it pertains to relationships, whether they're intimate or non-intimate, and what our needs are from all of those spaces and all of those relationships, and how we choose friends and how we choose tribe and what friends we go to about certain things. Those things I think still are true within relationships. We won't ever know ourselves fully, and surely the other person won't ever know us fully. But I think when it relates to interracial relationships particularly, it very much depends on what your needs are and how and what your expectations are of that person to show up. And if they're not meeting what those needs are in your own life, if you feel like you need to come home from work and speak about experiences within the workplace and that person's not showing up for you in the way that you need them to, then that's not your person. And those are decisions that I think people make in those types of relationships, individually. But I would urge those conversations to be taken up sooner than later, because please, I beg you, don't bring children into this. As a child of a mixed race, of an interracial marriage, because the complexities of what that, and in no way am I speaking on just the privilege of colorism in and of itself, because that is real, but we don't want to kind of move into another generation of people who have grown up with parents who haven't done the work. It's not great. So I think if people are in interracial relationships and how your experience is important to you, then that experience should kind of trickle into your thoughts about what your future might look like. Just to take that bit one bit further, but yeah.
So, Mark, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Just to add, I don't know, a bit of a religious perspective to it. Not necessarily Christian, but like religious in general. I think most religions would say that in a relationship, what should happen is that you're supposed to become one with your partner. And I would say that like these conversations need to take place in order for you to, like, you know, feel as if you're moving as a unit. And so I would say that they should take place under that banner, if that makes sense. You know, like, how do we become a unit? And I think if you're doing that, then you're doing the work that needs to be done.
So I'm curious. I wonder, do you think that there are Black people who have experienced pain, who feel as though getting into a relationship with a white person is escapism from pain in the Black community? Do they feel as though they're then becoming immune to it because they are seeing from someone else or joining in someone else's community?
That's interesting.
I think so.
Yeah, I think there are implications. In my mind, you know, when we think about marriage, or at least when I do, there's the love and the union and all of that. But like, marriage is a business at the end of the day. Like, it's a business transaction as well. And like, I have assets, you have assets. Let's put these together. Like, I often know, and I've observed conversations, been a part of conversations where women are like, well, yeah, I'm just trying to like level up and this is what I'm looking for. And so it is part of the list in which is being built. And so I do believe that there may be some implications of that when it comes to partnering with a white person.
Yeah, Kat, you thought that point was interesting. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I can't speak on all of us, do you know what I mean, as Black people, but that may be true for some folk. For some other, the choice may not be that explicit. For some people, it may just be yeah, I love this person. It may be just as kind of raw and as real as that. But again, like Shanika had said, for other people, there might be intention behind it for economic reasons, who knows, and access to privilege and a lot of those other things. But I personally would be weary of taking away agency from Black individuals as though the choice, in for whatever reasons, isn't theirs. And I think regardless of what the choices are, and the consequences or the benefits or whatever they are, that at the end of the day, yeah, again, the agency is the individual. We're not victims in a relationship that we've chosen to enter in. So I would be a little bit weary of that. Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'm not sure. I think for myself, having been in an interracial relationship, that those choices weren't those choices about dating a white person weren't necessarily around access or privilege, but a lot of it was about class in an implicit way, in that I'd never gone to or graduated from university, and none of the people within my class group had either. And so meeting someone that had gone to university, had done an MA and was doing a PhD, for me was completely outside of the class group of people that I had grown up with. And so it wasn't so much about access to privilege as it was about just having never been a part of a world where someone had access to all of that, if that makes any, does that make sense? And so for me, that was where maybe the attraction came from, or how that, yeah, I don't really know if you're following much, but that's kind of what, I feel like I'm doing loops in my own brain trying to figure it out as I'm saying it a bit, but it's kind of, yeah, that was a process. But again, this was all in retrospect. So yeah.
I think from my own personal perspective, I've never been in a relationship with a person who wasn't Black. For me, the only love I found growing up was in the Black community. The Black community loved me, and I never felt like the white community did. So for me, it was the only place that love ever came from when it came to friendships and when it came to relationships and things like that. So to me, it wouldn't even make sense for me to date a white person, because starting from when I was very young, it just felt as though, any level of my Blackness was just not understood by a white person. Anything that I needed in regards to that was just not felt and not understood. And at the same time, all I knew was love, right? So for me, I've never even considered being, multiracial. I've never considered dating somebody who wasn't Black, because there's just a certain level of understanding, I think I need, that I don't know if I can really get from a white person, right? Right on. Did you guys, any of Mark, stuff, Evan, have any thoughts? I'm gonna switch gears if you guys don't. Awesome. Shanika, I wanted to pose a question to you. How do you think your experience as a Black woman compares to some of your peers on the male side of the world?
So the Black woman's experience versus the Black men. It's been interesting, and I think the easiest example that I can showcase is looking at Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And this is not to put their injustices in competition with each other, in the very least. But overarchingly, we have seen the erasure of women, and they're just Black women, and then on top of that, and sometimes, unfortunately, from Black men. But I think looking at some of the cases that are still open, or not even open, but ignored, it's been hard to wrap my head around that. Breonna Taylor's birthday was yesterday, and while I did see this swell, her incident, it happened on March 13th, I believe. And that has been, I think, something that was called out on social and in conversations I've had about it. But that aside, I'm going to speak from my personal experience. For me, I don't want to use the word overcompensate, but I'm an overachiever. I'm a big sister. I was raised by my grandparents. And so I think those three things have contributed to the way in which I lean all the way in. I think some people may even call it aggressive, but like just it's also a way in which I'm aiming to garner some sense of security, because I didn't necessarily have those things, at least in my child brain, to say like, oh yeah, mom and dad are here and this is our house, and um, you know, we have tons of wealth. And so these are things now that I am aspiring to garner. And like you said, I love that Kat made a good point, outside of just bringing children in the world, like these are things that I'm concerned about before I even think about riding down that lane. And so I often see, and I have fellow friends who are have the same mindset in terms of being a Black woman. And sometimes that also could be the narrative of how you show up with your Black brothers. I know oftentimes we talk about the narrative of like Black women being uplifters of Black men, especially during this time, and that emotional labor or love and emotional offering is of importance. And so we grieve with Black men. We support and love, at least in my circle, and that is my intention. I think right now you have to also look at like male and female, right? I think men, there's a problem, they desire a solution. Women, there's a problem, we're gonna talk about it. It's gonna take a little while, perhaps. And so I think that is something that you also have to look at in terms of men and women. And then on top of that, the Black experience.
Yeah, and so you mentioned identity and kind of in who you were, and being a big sister, and being all of these things, and being a supporter of Black men through all of these pains. And we're all very familiar with some very stereotypical ideologies about who a Black woman is before we meet them. You
Right.
hear aggressive, you hear this word sassy, you hear all these microaggressional terms that we're using. How do you feel you've had to deal with battling these? Do you feel like you subscribe to some of them? Do you feel like you've had some of them placed on you that you've had to battle and push away throughout your upbringing?
Yeah, definitely. And it's been interesting, right? Because oftentimes like loud, angry are the go-to terms, but I also challenge like safe and eloquent and pretty. Like those are the words that have been placed on me in my experience. And I think while complimentary to some, whoever the speaker may be, it's hella triggering and bothersome to use those phrases as well, because then you're categorizing yet again, like just because I'm your one Black friend doesn't mean that this is the representation. Like we are not a monolith. And so yes, I've experienced it, but not the more negative words. Definitely the three words that I communicated just now. And specifically with speech, I think that's the biggest thing, right? Like, well, you don't speak like a Black girl, or you're so well spoken, or even interviews that I've had or speeches that I've given, and people not being like, yeah, you're impressed by the content and like what I'm saying and my education about the topic, but sometimes I confidently can say that you're more impressed by how I spoke about the topic. And so that is something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of my experience and what microaggressions I've personally had to go through.
Do you feel like these exist also within the Black community?
Oh, like
The term,
when you say that,
the you're loud, the you're sass, you're this kind of Black woman. Does that also come from within our community?
yeah, of course. Like I've heard in the store, parents like Black women to their children saying like, you don't want to be too loud, we're in this space. And no, I'm not talking about, it's in the context of there's a white salesperson and they're dealing with a transaction, or even how you walk through a specific neighborhood, or you're at a birthday party and it happens to be a predominantly white neighborhood. I remember like okay, we got invited to a birthday party, and like, yeah, make sure like you don't bump your head and do all this stuff, but like say good morning, like just reiterating all of these things that I think I often wonder, wow, if my life were to be played side by side with another friend who was white at this age and they were doing the same exact thing, would these conversations from their parents be happening?
Mark, you nodded big and heavy. I want to know what your thoughts are.
Oh, you can see me? Okay. No, I think I think if I'm understanding you correctly, Shanika, I think what you're saying is that you feel that through these compliments and these so-called microaggressions, what is lacking within them is, or what is communicating through them is that the other person has no real wish to see who you are as a person. And they're using these words or symbols to justify how they see you in their minds, but they're not trying to actually engage with who you are. And I'm wondering if that's what makes you feel as though like these words that are like meant to be compliments. I wonder if that's why you feel that they're like to be viewed in a negative light.
I think when it becomes something stereotypical, I think the process of deciding that another person is X, Y, and Z is what's harmful. And it's what you mentioned. It's not the conversation where you're understanding somebody and who they are. It's the conversation where you've already made up your mind, and it's almost like they're coming to you like, convince me that you're not. Convince me that this is that you're not this. And really, they don't even care whether you do or not, because their mind is made up. They're treating you as they've decided that they're going to treat you before the conversation started, before they knew they were going to have that conversation, right?
And definitely point to their larger ideas as well about who you should be, like you said. So when these kinds of words are kind of imposed on whoever the person is, it's not so much about you as an individual, but who the perceptions of who you're meant to be within their ideas of Black women or of Black men. And so when you kind of disrupt their own narrative in their minds, that's where these things come about as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the words, the microaggressions are there to get you back in line, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so remind you constantly that you're not being who you should be.
Yeah. Interesting. And so when you're saying, you know, that what you're doing is not in line and who you should be, what is it that we have to do to kind of change how our external coworkers and partners, is it our responsibility to change how they feel and how they look at us through that lens? Do we have to, where's their cat? Go ahead.
No, I have nothing.
No, I was just like, no. Whose responsibility is it to change, you know, is it global, is it grand, is it generational? How do we change that somebody will show up in a conversation and decide who you are before you speak to them?
I think this goes back to the point of when we were talking about, you know, starting within, right? Like, you blame it on whatever, but we're in 2020 now, right? And so for me, as much as we can claim like, no, it is not my responsibility to educate XYZ, I think the community and what I'm seeing on social, we have dumped all the text, all the spreadsheets, all the resources that we have referenced our very selves. And now I done gave you what you need. So go ahead and you know, dive in, ask questions, but don't ask me. Like, ask your family or ask, you know, have these conversations and say, hey, bring it to your executive boards in those intimate spaces where we're not present. I think that is something that needs to be reiterated and will probably need to be reiterated. I know that I've had to push back on saying like, answering what can I do or how can I help? Like even that, I'm just like, the hashtag has been utilized, honey. Like, so that is a step one, and my reply to this question.
Yeah, and that's emotional labor as well. Why do we need to take on emotional labor to solve somebody else's misguided thoughts and really detrimental, horrible, painful things that they've implied on us, right? Yeah, for sure. Sorry, Steph, for you.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. First of all, very well said, Shanika. I really appreciate that insight. And going back to the question, Nadia, of who is responsible, I hope you guys can forgive me because this is probably not the time to introduce this sort of thinking yet, but I want to introduce it, in that we really need to take a moment to examine our own individual agency and responsibility in these matters. And just tying back to the microaggressions, like what that is to say, when we receive microaggressions, what they're trying to say to us is, this is the person I need you to be for me. And so I want us to be thoughtful and considerate when we think about what ways are we suggesting to them, this is the person I need you to be for me. Do we have our own fixations, again, our own inferiority complexes that suggest I need you to be my oppressor so I can be a victim? I know this is a bit early to bring into the conversation, but I do think there's a time for us to think about what are we doing within our spaces that mirrors that sort of depravity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is industry specific, but I'm going to talk about the restaurant space really quick. I have worked in the restaurant space, and I love the hospitality industry. That's like where the vein in which a lot of my work resides. But if you look at the history of restaurants, in particular service, even that word alone is a little triggering there, but you're trained to, the guest is always right. You're trained to not bring confrontation. The experience has to be seamless. And in some ways, I even had alluded to this in a story post, but as much as I love that service, I learned so much performative behavior that restricted me from saying like, no, I definitely didn't miscount, and like, this is how much is in my drawer, or no, like this person spoke sideways and I no longer want to be serving their table, so I need somebody else to like come in here. And so, yeah, there are ways in which that's on an institutional level, but I think that definitely has that was a part of my life for many years. And I'm not going to say it immediately escaped me once I left that space, so that's one specific example, but resonated with the question that you posed, Stefan.
Yeah, and speaking of the industry, not to give them too much of my personal bandwidth, but one of my former employees has been under fire for racist practices in banning certain kinds of music. And when I was there, I worked part-time, maybe 4 hours every other week. So I asked somebody the other day what it was like for him working there full-time and how he experienced racism within that restaurant. When I posed a question to him, I asked him, why didn't you leave? And I asked him that, and also, applying to so many of the Black people that work there. When you saw this, why didn't you leave? And for him, the answer was almost like backed into a corner. This is my income. This is what I'm relying on. I show up here to make my rent, to buy my groceries. So it's like, it's almost cyclical in a way that, we don't want to be a victim and we can't play the victim, but is it a system that's pushing us into being a victim because somebody's telling you that's where you're getting your money? I think that's something that's really important for us in the conversation of uplifting Black businesses and for really focusing on the action that employers and corporations are taking. We need to create spaces where Black people feel as though they can show up at work, be who they are, and not face microaggressions in any workplace, in every workplace, no matter what your industry is, no matter what your profession is, right? Like that's, I think, something that's a narrative that we need to really, really hone in on is how do we make this feeling of equality feel global, and how do we push that really deeply into the corporate world, into the service industry, into every single industry that we're all within, right? How do we come to a place where we don't have to be backed into a corner working for a racist prick, working for a company that says, I want to ban this kind of music, keep those people out, no island garbage in this restaurant. And that was literal words that came from the general manager of a very, very popular Toronto restaurant chain, right? Like that's just, it's, you know, it's something that I think that's the kind of work that also starts from within as well, is providing for each other, and building these networks and building these communities ourselves, and that healing that really starts within our own community, where we are creating, and we are, as Steph said the other day, we are adding to this, and we are providing, and we are creating, so that we can create an ecosystem where we don't have to stand with our backs against the wall.
I'm thinking a little bit, about the restaurant. Sorry, Evan, go ahead.
I wanted to, I feel like I've been like thinking about this exact theme for a long time, and I feel like it distills down to just the idea of choice. And I think about that example that you brought up, and like, you ask, why do you still work there? And it's like, it's obvious, like I need to pay, I need to survive, I need to provide things for myself. But like, you are not limited. Those are not the only choices either. You still have more, like, it's the imagination of choices. Like, you still have more choices. You still have more things you can do. And tying it to the responsibility, I feel like anyone who is without power, it is their responsibility to find power. Because the people who have power either are, one, not aware that they have power, or they are actively keeping power from you. So in both scenarios, you must acquire power somehow, or at least some sort of equality. So I'm thinking of myself, and like, even like companies I've worked for, or teams, as soon as you brought up music, I thought about an example of when I was playing in university and our coach banned like rap music, hip hop music. And it's only until this moment I realized that I allowed him to do that. There was no sort of creativity in terms of pushback, trying to find ways to, I just kind of accepted it. It was something that I didn't ask, hey, so like, I just noticed you don't like this. And, he imposes power, and it's like, no, it's not about this, it's that. And I'm like, okay. So I've immediately taken on a mindset where like, now I'm wrong, where I know I still have choices. I can choose to accept his reality, or I can choose to continue to learn. And it's like, you're just in a constant state of choosing. You have to continue to choose, whether you like this reality or you don't. And I'm not too sure if you guys listen to Revisionist History. It's the Malcolm Gladwell podcast. He has an old episode, and he talks about Black people, or just Black students at Yale, and they're protesting the building of this building, and they're putting this inherently racist president's name on this building, and they're like, we don't want this guy's name. And they're protesting. They're in the building, and it goes through all of these different channels. They're doing all these different things, and eventually the school decides that while this is true, he's had a dark past, and like, we're acknowledging it, we still don't think we want to like take his name off, or we don't think it's enough, basically. And basically what the students did were like, they're still like, no, this is not right. But they, in terms of imagination and choice, it's like, you don't have to go there. Right? We continue, like, I think sometimes I fail to see my choices, like, because it's you want something, and it's a very difficult choice to make. It's hard. It's like, I will suffer in some sort of way, but like, I think we also need to remember that we have choices. We can always continue to choose. Mahatma Gandhi chose to starve. Nobody, I don't think he wants to starve, but that was his way of protesting. So yeah, in terms of whose responsibility, and like that idea of, I want to remember that I have a choice at all times, in all places. And I don't want people who look like me to forget that they have a choice, to forget that this does not have to be this way, and that we can continue to think about different ways, and we don't have to accept the current way, and it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be, I can create something completely different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so on the topic of choice, do you think systemically the education system is not doing enough to ensure that as we grow up, we know we have choice?
Yeah, I think this is to Stefan's point. You have to, not specifically about inferiority, but like you have to believe, the system has to create something where you feel like you don't have any more choices, that you have to accept the reality, right? And I just think about my responsibility now, as at least in someone who is interested in elevating myself and consider all possible things and consider all possible choices. And I want to make this like, just bring this all back to like the individual and the individual's decision to do whatever they want to do, and that we all have a choice in how we do things. And like, if that means leaving, then that's your choice. And like you have to know you have it. Right? And like, it's not, I'm not trying to say it's fair. That's a different conversation. Like, I just want to make sure that we remember that we are choosing it, and that we could also find something else to choose to do as well. Just want to make sure that I would want to make sure I have cement that we have choice all the time.
Oh, okay.
Like, just in all things, like, I'm not trying to say things are fair and that like, oh yeah, just get on with it. And like, he has to continue to work in that place. And like, yeah, you're choosing that. It's like, no. Yeah, you are choosing that, but there's another choice to be made the next day. She's like, how do you fight this? How do you?
I would interject here and just, I definitely hear you in terms of like acknowledgement of choice. I think oftentimes when situations where your back is up against the wall, like, is your logic like, I am like, okay, is it fight or flight? Is it defense? Like, it's not to say my mental state is always in the most clear to even consider I love the idealism of the choice, but we also have to look to like, this is specific to restaurant industry where undocumented workers are, like, I don't really have no choice because, I know what I need to do to survive here in this place, but I might not make it home. I might be detained. I might have to go back. Like, and as much as I love the heroism of like cleaning up my desk and like walking out, I think there is also this responsibility to the other people, right? As much as it's individual, like there are responsibilities to my family, my children, things of that nature. So I definitely understand. And I definitely think I love your point and said someone who wants to elevate themselves. I think on the path of elevating, also having support systems in place, just like these protesters are ensuring that they have support systems in place if some shit goes down. Like, I think we have to look at every single part of livelihood in order to kind of lean into those other choices that are available.
I want to build on what you just said, Shanika, and continue on Evan's vein. I think it's useful to introduce awareness of the decisions and the choice in front of you. But there is a critical nuance between what is a rope and what is a chain. A chain can't just simply be undone. You can't just simply do work to break a chain. You're locked in a profound way. So I need to know the difference. And I think actually the work to be done, and even in these spaces, in these conversations, I think where we can add real value to the conversation is teasing out the difference between a rope and a chain. There are some things that are actually within your power to do if you were to have the tools, the awareness, the education to see them as ropes, to know what sort of strategies and tactics you can take to unwrap yourself from them. But there are certainly chains that we are bound to, physiologically. Like, They're things that we cannot undo with tools and inspiration and empowerment and self-help books. This certain stuff that just can't be undone. And I think that nuance is critical if we're going to introduce choice.
As well as thinking about like how the idea of respectability has infiltrated our ideas of how this systemic racism has trickled into so many areas of, let's use the restaurant industry, for example, and how so many food writers and journalists throughout time have referred to Caribbean food, Vietnamese food, and all these other cuisines as antiquated or lagging and all these other words. And then you turn around, and when an area is gentrified and people are displaced from it, all of a sudden jerk chicken is on the menu in the shape of street food. So we have to think about the ideas that when we're exploring choice, for example, and we think about, okay, it's our choice to, it's a bit, it feels for me, from where I'm seated, a bit victim blamey in that, you know, if only we made these particular choices, then that would disrupt the whole structure, and then we'd no longer be kind of where we are in this hierarchy. But again, like, we've seen so many examples of, you know, street food coming in, and the language that's used to describe things on the menu has changed, and all of a sudden the things that we've presented are no longer appetizing. And so I think, again, we're not necessarily always and usually not responsible for the interpretations and the things that other people have kind of imposed on us. And we've seen how there's created shifts in the ways that cultural appropriation has changed, and has made it really, really hard for us to access things from the base level all the way up to the corporate world. So I think, thinking about choice is difficult, and also looking at us at our individual privileges, and not just privilege, but just our own individual situations. And that same truth is not necessarily true of Black people globally, Black people again, across the world, trans Black folk. Like, it's just difficult. For thinking about Blackness, we're thinking about ourselves in all of these ways that we intersect, not just as, You
talked about the concept of victim blaming when we're talking about choice. So I want to pose kind of two concepts to you guys. And when I think about choice, I think about, and if we're talking about the example of a person not thinking that they have a choice to leave their employer. Shanika, you mentioned earlier that your grandmother telling you just started this job, and to not speak up. Is it generational, where passed down from a survival mode kicked in for our parents and our grandparents' generation, where the reason why they were backed into a corner and they felt as though they had no choice is because those were different times. 30, 40, 50 years ago, you felt different. And is it something that has been learned, and what do we have to do to unlearn that survival mode, to really stand into this agency and this choice that we now have in a different and a better world? And then the other thought I have about that is also systemic. So when I say systemic from an education system point of view, I'm thinking about how teachers are influencing a Black student's image of their self, and how they feel that they can perform in their adult life. Is it a systemic change that has to happen, where Black students are getting more support and being listened to and heard more often, so that they feel that if they weren't good at X, Y, and Z academic subjects, and they couldn't do well in school academically, how do we explore a different world for them? Are they looking at trades where they can be successful? How do we get them out of my back's against the wall, and feeling as though they have their own personal skills and they have their own personal assets to bring to a job, so that they feel like they do have a choice? Sorry, I know I threw a lot at you, but those are my kind of victim blaming and choices, my two thoughts there.
Sure. I think something that I want to introduce now to this ask is an observation that I'm seeing. Obviously, there are a lot of list generating happening, like Black-owned businesses, Black-owned restaurants, Black-owned banks. But I'm also excitedly watching a lot of individuals who are standing for this, putting like their money where their mouth is, and saying, you know, look at Tulsa. There was a point in history where Black people were economically sustainable in every single way, shape, or form. They owned buildings. They owned the access to revenue because it was their revenue. And I think there are hints of coming together, organizing, and putting that money back into Black banks that exist. Taking your onus wherever you are and saying, hey, we're now in a digital space where kids are learning on tech. Like, let's get Black teachers together and teach the history that was erased in our textbooks. Talk about maybe their spirituality and not necessarily just this Christian mindset. Various things that I've been observing, but I'm interested to see how these little bits of organization and those conversations and actions will take place in the coming weeks. But that is something, I think, a response to your question and how some people are looking forward to and putting out the playbook for what that could look like.
Yeah.
Two things just quickly. Sorry, Nadia. One is just a time check because I appreciate this has been an hour and a half already, so I don't know where people's day status is at. And this is a bit of an objective observation just in this conversation, just listening to Shanika, like you speaking these truths right now is elevating my consciousness as a Black person. Like that's real work. That's like really beneficial. Like that's how I can now think about, okay, in the hours and resources and money that I have within my space, what can I do now to engage in a meaningful way? Like that was a rich example of Black solidarity in a productive way, not in just protest and awareness. Like I get that is necessary work, but what I need to do is fellowship with you in these spaces and think about what are we gonna do? Like how is this gonna manifest? How is this gonna appear? How are we gonna measure ourselves in this agenda, and not just like more and more musings.
Mark, did you
Um,
cut your mute?
oh yeah, I did. No, I was just about to defend Evan. Like so, like I kind of wanted to revisit the idea of having a choice. So I think to Evan's point, we do have choice. It's just the case with marginalized people that we don't have a lot of choices.
Mm.
And I think what Evan was pointed out, or what Evan was saying, what it meant for me more than anything else is finding a way to justify the fight for equality. Because yes, I can be oppressed, but also I can choose to check out of the game. That is that my oppression is based on. And this is going to sound cruel, but if I don't want to be oppressed anymore, I could commit suicide. Like I have the choice to check out of the game entirely. And so since I'm here, I feel that like what I'm doing is I'm choosing life, so to speak. And I'm choosing to fight against my oppression. And that more than anything else is what choice means to me. I'm not sure if that's what Evan was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring it to like myself. I just like all the way in consciously. Every move I make, I choose it. Do you mean like, and I'm not trying to say that there aren't external factors that are working against me. There isn't a world there's worlds or systems that are built around me that limit my choices or have put me in this position. Does that make sense? Like it's not use like a video game. Like I don't get to choose where I respond, and like I don't get to like start where I want to start. You know, I've been played here. I've been given the skin color, and the way my parents have chosen things to do is affected me. But now the more I think about my own decisions, I can decide what to do. And I'm not trying to say that they are for the good or they're going to be like beneficial or detrimental to me. I think I need to be aware of them. I need to be aware that I can leave if I want to, and if I'm not going to, I'm going to bear this, and it's not fair. But I also know I have a responsibility. Like, I am aware of those things, and in that, I find that, like, I'm choosing this for my family. Like, I'm choosing it for them, because I could be selfish and leave. Because, you know, like, you have to realize that you are, anything you do, anything, even showing up to this conversation, you've chosen to come here. You've chosen to open your mouth. You've chosen to hit mute or share, and Shanika impacting all of us and giving us a new awareness. You know, you don't just do it. You know, you have to decide to do it. And what, like, the scariest thought that, I don't know if it's Will Smith, but there's a quote just like, the scariest thought is that one day you can just decide to change your life. You can just wake up and decide to do something different that you've never done before. And that's terrifying, because how many different things could I do to, like, put myself in danger, to stand up for something I believe, to be silent and suffer? It's just like, I must become aware of all of my choices. And I'm like Mark says, I am consciously trying to expand people who look like me's choices. I want to give us more. You know, I don't know. I think that's where I wanted to, I don't know, bringing it very much to consciousness and spirituality. Like, I know I have the choice to do whatever I want to do, and not on a larger or systemic point of view, although this is where the conversation is. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
oh, sorry.
What? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Nadia.
I was going to move on, so if you want to finish on Evan's thought.
Nah, it's fine. You can move right along.
Oh, Evan. Yeah, so to Steph's point about the time, we want to be mindful of the time. One point that I do want to make is to thank everybody who did show up today, participating or in the audience. You made a great choice, and we're doing this together. And shout out to Evan's point, but we are doing this together.
Wow.
And we Shanika, for having shown up with us and been able to speak with us today on some difficult topics. Thank you, and really pat yourself on the back for showing up and for making an amazing choice, right? Yeah, you go, girl. So the last person I'll ask, it's deep, but it is on the theme of wrapping up. Shanika,
Yeah.
what do you think the start of the end of this state we're in right now, what is it?
The start of the end of where we are right now.
How do we get to a point where we don't feel like we need to go outside and protest? What tells us that we're okay?
I think this is going to take an individual standpoint, but I think you have to tell yourself that you're okay, right? Like, I think there's something, do I believe that we will never have to protest again? I don't believe that in my lifetime, unfortunately. But I will say that being well within spirit and self is a wonderful thing. Having fear, it's easy, right? Like COVID-19, there was this huge fear of the unknown, right? And I think I myself was guilty of placing even more anxiety and fear on top of that, because I was telling myself stories. And so, to answer your question, being aligned with yourself enough to say, I'm okay with this. I'm equipped to go out in this space in myself, fully and wholly. And in tandem, I will uplift someone to do the same.
Yeah, beautiful. That's amazing. Shanika, thank you for that, and I'll thank you a million times over again for showing up with us today. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We'll wrap up and give you guys a bit more of your Saturday back. Sending everybody lots of love. Everybody be safe in your protests, in your conquest, and everything you do. Don't forget to take care of yourself, rest up, and make sure that you're using your community and your resources to the full extent. So thank you all.
Yes.
And we will
Thank you for organizing.
Oh,
Nadia, thank you for such a beautiful exposition of conversation. Really well done with your hosting, and Shanika bringing heat as always.
Oh, one last thing. Tell people where they can find you. Both of
Oh,
you.
here, I can put it in the chat. You know, I'm on the gram, y'all. That's my like favorite platform. But on there, you know, I'm open to email, so that is also in the chat. And yeah, we can go from there.
You're sending it to us and I'll copy and paste it to the group.
Ah, shoot, girl, sorry. This thing, I'm about to.
I gotcha.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right.
See you everybody tomorrow at 7 right here.
Peace and love.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.